The restaurant hummed with the kind of quiet confidence that only old money could buy. Crystal chandeliers cast honeyed light over tables dressed in ivory linens, and the gentle murmur of conversations blended with the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. Before we continue, thank you for spending your time with this story. If you're enjoying it so far, please watch till the end and subscribe. At a small table near the window, 26-year-old Helen C. Harris sat alone, her fingers resting lightly against the base of a water glass she hadn't yet touched. She had chosen this restaurant deliberately, the kind of place where she could disappear into the elegance around her. After a suffocating week of tight deadlines and tighter budgets, she needed this, one evening where she could exist without apologizing for taking up space. The reservation had been an impulse, a rare moment of indulgence for someone who usually ate dinner standing at her kitchen counter. Helen had dressed carefully in her simple cream dress, the one that made her feel graceful without drawing attention. She had pulled her soft brown hair back in a loose twist, leaving a few strands to frame her face. She had even worn the delicate silver bracelet her mother had given her years ago, before everything changed. If she was going to treat herself, she decided at least she would do it while feeling like she belonged. The waiter approached with practiced discretion, his movements fluid as he placed a menu before her. Helen could sense the curious glances from nearby tables, the silent questions about the young woman dining alone in a place designed for couples and celebrations. She kept her eyes on the menu, her composure carefully maintained, even as heat crept up her neck. Then she felt it. The weight of eyes on her skin, different from the casual curiosity of strangers. Deliberate. Assessing. Helen looked up to find an elegant woman standing beside her table. She appeared to be in her early 60s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and wearing a black designer gown that probably cost more than Helen's entire yearly wardrobe. Diamond rings caught the candlelight as the woman's hand rested on the back of the empty chair across from Helen. The woman leaned down, close enough that Helen could smell her expensive perfume, close enough that no one else could hear. "Pretend you're my son's fiancée," she whispered, her voice warm but carrying an edge of steel that made Helen's breath catch. "Just for tonight. Please." Helen's heart slammed against her ribs. Her mouth opened but no sound emerged. This couldn't be happening. This was insane. She should refuse, should stand up and leave, should. But before Helen could form a single word of protest, before she could even process what was being asked of her, the woman straightened to her full height. Her posture shifted, commanding the attention of the entire room. "Everyone," the woman's voice rang out across the restaurant like a bell, clear and unmistakable. "I'd like you to introduce my future daughter-in-law." The world tilted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison. Faces she didn't recognize stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to calculation. Helen felt frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly gone liquid beneath her feet. And then, from the shadows near the bar, a man stepped forward. Tall, dark-haired, impossibly handsome in a way that made her chest tighten. He moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested violence held barely in check, and his eyes, gray like smoke and storm clouds, locked onto Helen's with an intensity that stole what little breath she had left. Arlie R. Hebert. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know the weight it carried, didn't know that people whispered it in fear rather than admiration. But she felt the danger radiating from him like heat from a flame. He crossed the restaurant floor in measured strides, his gaze never leaving her face. When he reached her table, he extended his hand, not in greeting but in possession. "Darling," he said, his voice low and dark as midnight. "I'm sorry I'm late." Helen stared at his outstretched hand, her mind screaming at her to run, to expose the lie, to save herself. But the woman's eyes held a silent warning. The watching faces held expectation. And something in Arlie's expression, barely visible beneath the cold mask he wore, held something that looked almost like resignation. Helen placed her trembling hand in his. And just like that, she belonged to him. Helen pulled her hand free the moment the applause died down. Her chair scraped against polished marble as she stood, her pulse hammering in her throat. She didn't look at Arlie, didn't acknowledge the woman who had destroyed her life with a single sentence. She just moved toward the exit, her cream dress a pale blur against the dark wood paneling. She made it 3 steps before a man in a black suit materialized in front of her. Not a waiter. Security. His expression was blank, professional, immovable. "Miss Harris," he said quietly, his hand gesturing toward a hallway she hadn't noticed before. "This way, please. I'm leaving." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm afraid that's not possible right now." His tone was polite. His stance was a wall. 2 more men appeared at her periphery, boxing her in without touching her. Helen's stomach dropped. She looked back at her table, at the woman who still stood there with that serene, satisfied expression, and realized with cold clarity that this had never been a request. They escorted her down a corridor lined with oil paintings worth more than her entire existence, through a heavy door, into a private dining room that smelled of leather and old money. The door closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling. Arlie stood by the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid beneath his perfectly tailored suit. When he turned, the fury in his eyes was barely leashed. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His voice was low, dangerous, each word carefully controlled. "I didn't do anything," Helen shot back, her fear transmuting into anger. "That woman, your mother, she didn't give me a choice. And you think I did?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just close enough to make her heart race for entirely different reasons. "I didn't ask for this either." "Then let me leave. Tell them it was a mistake." Arlie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You really don't understand, do you?" He pulled out his phone, swiped through screens, then held it up to her face. Helen stared at the image. It was her, taken moments ago, Arlie's hand clasping hers. The caption identified her by name. Her full name. The article was already spreading across social media, news sites, gossip columns. "Every major player in this city now knows your face," Arlie said, his voice flat. "Every rival family. Every enemy I've made. Every person who wants leverage over me." He lowered the phone. "Going home is no longer safe." The room tilted. Helen gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "This can't be happening." "But it is." He studied her with those storm-gray eyes, and for a moment, something almost like regret flickered across his features. "My mother chose you for a reason. She always has a reason." He moved toward the door, then paused. "My men will take you to the estate. You'll stay there until we determine what to do with you." "With me?" Helen's voice cracked. "I'm not some problem to be managed." Arlie looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "That's exactly what you are now. Welcome to the family, Miss Harris." The door opened. The security detail waited. Anne Helen understood, with dawning horror that froze the blood in her veins. She wasn't walking out of this restaurant as the same woman who'd walked in. The cage was already locked. And she'd never even heard it close. The Hebert mansion rose from the darkness like something out of a fever dream, all stone and wrought iron, with windows that gleamed like watchful eyes. The SUV swept through gates that closed behind them with a finality that made Helen's chest tighten. Inside, wealth whispered from every surface. Marble floors stretched beneath crystal chandeliers. Oil paintings and gilded frames lined corridors that seemed to go on forever. It was beautiful. It was suffocating. It was a fortress. Miss Harris. A woman in her 50s appeared, her gray uniform immaculate, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm Mrs. Voss, the head housekeeper. I'll show you to your rooms." Helen followed her up a curved staircase, past doors she didn't dare ask about, to a suite at the end of the east wing. Mrs. Voss opened the door to reveal a bedroom larger than Helen's entire apartment. 4-poster bed. Silk curtains. A sitting area with furniture that probably cost more than she made in a year. "If you need anything, use the phone." Mrs. Voss gestured to the bedside table. "Dinner is at 8. Mr. Hebert expects punctuality." The door closed. Helen heard the soft click of a lock that she suspected wasn't on her side. A gilded cell indeed. She appeared in the dining room at precisely 8 o'clock, wearing the same cream dress because no one had thought to provide alternatives. The table could have seated 20. Only 2 places were set, facing each other across an expanse of polished mahogany. Arlie stood when she entered, a gesture of courtesy that felt like mockery under the circumstances. He'd changed into a black shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, and somehow looked even more dangerous without the suit jacket's civilizing influence. "Sit," he said. "Not quite an order. Not quite a request." Helen sat. Staff appeared with wine, with courses prepared by someone who understood that food could be art. Helen barely tasted any of it. Arlie ate with methodical precision, his silence a presence all its own. "There are rules," he finally said, setting down his fork. "In public you're devoted, affectionate, convincing. You maintain the lie no matter who's watching. And in private?" Helen met his eyes across the table. "In private you stay out of my business. You don't ask questions. You don't wander where you're not invited." His jaw tightened. "And you don't fall in love. That won't be a problem." Something flickered in his expression. Amusement, maybe, or recognition of her defiance. "My mother thinks you're malleable. Controllable." He lifted his wine glass. "Are you? I guess we'll find out." For the first time since the restaurant, Arlie almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it softened the hard edges of his face. "My father built this empire on blood and fear. When he died, I inherited both. My mother thinks I need legitimizing, a wife from the right background to help clean our money, make us respectable." He took a slow sip. "That's what you are. A prop in her performance." "And what are you?" Helen asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked at her fully, then really looked, and she saw exhaustion beneath the armor. A man who'd never been asked what he wanted, only what he could provide. "Trapped," he said finally. "Just like you." The admission hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Mrs. Voss appeared to clear the plates, and the moment shattered. But as Helen was escorted back to her gilded cell, she understood something fundamental. This wasn't just an empire built on violence. It was a prison that held them all. The gown appeared in Helen's suite that afternoon, midnight blue silk that clung and flowed in equal measure, with a neckline just daring enough to suggest confidence she didn't feel. Shoes that cost more than her monthly rent. Diamond earrings that were probably real. Mrs. Voss helped her dress, saying nothing as she pinned Helen's hair into an elegant twist. When Helen looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked like she belonged in Arlie's world. The lie was already reshaping her. The charity gala occupied the entire top floor of the city's most exclusive hotel. Crystal and champagne, designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, air thick with money and secrets. Helen felt every eye on her the moment she entered on Arlie's arm. His hand settled on her waist, warm, possessive, a brand that announced ownership. She felt the tension in his fingers, the controlled power in the way he guided her through the crowd. "Smile," he murmured against her ear, his breath warm on her skin. "Like you're exactly where you want to be." Helen smiled. It felt like a mask settling into place. They moved through the room like dancers executing choreography only he knew. Arlie introduced her to men with cold eyes and calculating smiles, to women who assessed her like a stock portfolio, to couples whose handshakes felt like threats disguised as courtesy. "Anthony Marconi," Arlie said, steering her toward a silver-haired man with a cruel mouth. "He runs the South Side. Smile, but don't volunteer information." "Mr. Marconi," Helen said warmly, extending her hand. "What a pleasure." Marconi's grip lingered too long. "The pleasure is mine. Arlie's been keeping you hidden." "Only until I was certain she was mine," Arlie interjected smoothly, his arm tightening around Helen's waist. The possessiveness in his voice sounded disturbingly real. "Smart man." Marconi's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Beautiful things attract attention." "Then it's fortunate she's not a thing," Arlie said, ice beneath the courtesy. The tension crackled. Helen felt it in the way nearby conversations paused, in how Marconi's expression hardened for just a fraction of a second before he laughed and moved away. "Lean into me," Arlie whispered. "Make it look natural." Helen did, her body pressing against his side. His hand slid to her hip, steadying her. Or claiming her. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. She watched him work the room, calculating which conversations to join, which to avoid, reading undercurrents she couldn't yet see. He was powerful, commanding, a man who controlled everything around him with surgical precision. He was also utterly, devastatingly alone. Even surrounded by hundreds, he moved through the crowd like a wolf among sheep, never dropping his guard, never truly connecting. Every smile was strategy. Every touch was theater. And Helen was his newest prop. The drive home was silent. Arlie stared out the window, tension radiating from him like heat. When they reached the mansion, he walked her to her suite, something he'd never done before. At her door he stopped, looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that had witnessed too much. "You handled that better than most," he said quietly. Helen searched his face for mockery, for condescension. Found only something that looked like honest surprise. Maybe even respect. "Was I convincing?" she asked. "Too convincing." His jaw tightened. "Get some rest, Helen." He turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you," he added, so softly she almost didn't hear it. The door closed. Helen stood alone in her gilded cell, her heart racing for reasons she didn't want to examine. Something had shifted tonight. Something dangerous. Helen found Mrs. Hebert in the solarium the next morning, surrounded by orchids that probably cost more than Helen's college tuition. The matriarch sat in a cream-colored chair like a queen on a throne, sipping tea from porcelain so delicate it was nearly translucent. "Mrs. Hebert." Helen's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I want to know why you chose me." The older woman didn't look up from her tea. "Close the door, dear." Helen did, her pulse hammering. When she turned back, Mrs. Hebert was finally looking at her, those sharp blue eyes assessing, calculating. "Sit." "I'd rather stand." A thin smile touched Mrs. Hebert's lips. "Then stand. But listen carefully because I'll only explain this once." She set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "You have the right look. Pretty but not threatening, refined but not ostentatious. You have the right background, middle class, educated, no criminal connections. And most importantly, Helen, you're nobody." The words landed like a slap. "You won't complicate things," Mrs. Hebert continued, her tone almost gentle. "No family expecting influence, no social circle demanding explanations, no history that could embarrass us. You're a blank slate I can write on." She picked up her tea again. "You're controllable." Helen's hands curled into fists at her sides. "You don't know anything about me. I know everything about you. Your modest apartment in the city. Your entry-level position at that marketing firm. Your carefully maintained distance from anything resembling ambition." Mrs. Hebert's smile widened. "You've spent your entire life trying not to be noticed. I'm simply taking advantage of that." Heat flooded Helen's cheeks, shame and fury in equal measure. "And if I refuse to play along? Then you'll discover exactly how dangerous it is to embarrass the Hebert family." The warmth drained from Mrs. Hebert's voice like air from a punctured lung. "I chose you because you could be controlled, dear. Don't make me prove it." Helen left the solarium with her composure barely intact, rage burning behind her ribs. She needed air, needed space, needed to think. She found herself in a corridor near Arlie's study, about to turn back, when she heard voices through the partially open door. Selected specifically because of her connection. Mrs. Hebert's voice, crisp and businesslike. What connection? A man's voice Helen didn't recognize. "You said she was nobody." Her former employer, the marketing firm. "The CEO is Richard Ashford." Helen's breath caught. Richard Ashford. She'd never met him personally, but she knew the name. Everyone did. "Ashford's been looking for legitimate investment opportunities," Mrs. Hebert continued. "Clean money, respectable ventures. When he hears that one of his employees is marrying into the Hebert family, he'll see an opportunity. A bridge between his world and ours. And if he doesn't take the bait, he will. Men like Ashford are always looking for the next advantage. Helen is that advantage, she just doesn't know it yet." The other voice laughed. "Clever. Using her as bait without her even realizing she's part of the trap." Helen backed away from the door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She wasn't just a prop in Mrs. Hebert's performance. She was bait in a larger game, a bridge to legitimacy the family desperately needed. And everyone, Mrs. Hebert, Arlie, the entire organization, was using her to build it. She made it back to her suite before the trembling started. But beneath the fear, beneath the betrayal, something else burned. Anger. Mrs. Hebert had called her nobody. Had assumed she was controllable. It was time to prove her wrong. The business meeting was supposed to be routine. Helen wasn't even meant to attend, but Mrs. Hebert had insisted. Another performance, another opportunity to play the devoted fiancée. She sat beside Arlie in the mansion's conference room, surrounded by men in expensive suits discussing investments that were probably anything but legitimate. Then the window exploded. Glass shattered inward like deadly rain. Helen heard the crack of gunfire, saw muzzle flashes from the gardens. Chaos erupted, men shouting, chairs overturning, the conference table splintering as bullets tore through wood. Arlie's body slammed into hers, driving her to the floor. His weight crushed the air from her lungs as he covered her completely, one hand cradling her head, the other reaching for the gun at his waist. More shots. The acrid smell of gunpowder. Someone screaming. Then silence, broken only by ragged breathing and the distant wail of sirens. "Don't move," Arlie growled against her ear. "Not until I say." Helen couldn't have moved if she'd wanted to. Terror had locked her muscles, turned her bones to ice. She felt Arlie's heart hammering against her back, felt the tension coiled in every inch of him. "Clear," someone shouted. Arlie shifted, his hands immediately moving over her, checking her arms, her shoulders, turning her face toward him with fingers that trembled despite his apparent control. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, urgent. "Helen, look at me. Are you hurt?" She managed to shake her head. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes, searched her face with something that looked dangerously close to fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his hands didn't release her. "You shouldn't?" He stopped, jaw clenching, and pulled her into his chest. Just for a moment. Just long enough for her to feel him shaking. Then he let go and became the Mafia boss again, barking orders, securing the scene, every trace of vulnerability locked away. But Helen had felt it. That moment of raw, unguarded humanity. She couldn't sleep that night. The gunfire still echoed in her ears, the phantom weight of Arlie's body still pressed against her back. Near midnight, she left her suite and wandered the darkened halls, drawn by instinct to the light bleeding from beneath Arlie's study door. She found him sitting in shadow, a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand, staring at nothing. He didn't look up when she entered. "You should be resting," he said quietly. "So should you." Helen closed the door behind her. "But here we are." Arlie finally looked at her, and the exhaustion in his face made him look younger, more vulnerable. "I was 10 when my father brought me to my first execution. 12 when I watched him torture a man who'd betrayed us. 15 when I killed someone for the first time." He took a long drink. He wanted to make sure I understood the empire I'd inherit. The blood it was built on. Helen moved closer, drawn by the rawness in his voice. "Did you want this life?" "What?" He laughed bitterly. "I was born into it. Want was never part of the equation." He set down his glass. "My father built this empire. My mother maintains it. And I'm the weapon they use to protect it." "You're not just a weapon," Helen said softly. "Aren't I?" He looked at her with something raw and bleeding in his eyes. "Today I used my body to shield you without thinking. That's what I am, violence in a suit, reflexes honed for survival. I don't know how to be anything else." Helen sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You could have let them take me. Used me as a distraction, saved yourself. But you didn't." "No," he admitted. "I didn't." The silence between them felt different now. Intimate. Dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with bullets. "I'm starting to understand," Helen whispered. "You're as trapped as I am." Arlie turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Then we're both damned." But he didn't move away. And neither did she. The envelope arrived during breakfast. Plain manila, no return address, delivered directly to Arlie's hand by one of his men whose face had gone pale. Arlie opened it. went completely still. Helen watched his expression shift from curiosity to something cold and lethal that made the air in the room feel thin. Without a word, he slid a photograph across the table. Helen's hand shook as she picked it up. It was her, leaving her old apartment 3 days ago, the place she hadn't been back to since the restaurant. Written across the bottom in red ink, "We know she's nobody. How long before everyone else does?" "There's more," Arlie said, his voice deadly quiet. He spread out additional photos like a deck of cards. Helen at the grocery store 2 weeks ago. Helen walking to work. Helen alone, unprotected, utterly vulnerable. They'd been watching her long before Mrs. Hebert had whispered in her ear. "Who?" Helen started. "Marconi." Arlie's fury was volcanic, barely contained. "He's been digging. And he found something." His fist slammed onto the table hard enough to rattle the china. "We're leaving. Now." Within the hour, Helen found herself in an SUV speeding toward the city's outskirts. The safe house was a modern fortress disguised as a modest home. Reinforced walls, bulletproof glass, security systems that probably cost more than the building itself. And inside, just the two of them. Arlie paced like a caged animal, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders. Helen sat on the leather sofa, trying to process that someone had been cataloging her movements, building a case against her existence. "How did they know?" she asked when he finally ended the call. "Someone told them." His jaw clenched. "Someone inside my organization is feeding information to Marconi." "A traitor." "A dead man," Arlie corrected darkly. "When I find him." Night fell. The power cut out without warning, not an accident, Arlie's expression said. Backup generators hummed to life, but he killed them immediately. "Quieter this way," he explained, moving to the windows. "Harder to track." Darkness swallowed them whole. Helen heard him moving through the shadows with practiced ease, checking locks, securing exits. When he returned, he was close enough that she could feel his body heat. "If Marconi moves on this," Arlie said quietly, "if he exposes you publicly." "I know." Helen's voice was barely a whisper. "Your mother's plan falls apart. The alliance dies. Everything crumbles. That's not what I'm worried about." His hand found her face in the darkness, fingers tracing her jawline with unexpected gentleness. "If they come for you, Helen?" She reached up, caught his wrist. "They come for both of us." The air between them felt electric, charged with weeks of forced proximity and denied attraction. Helen could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven. Could feel the tension vibrating through him. "This is a mistake," Arlie said, but he was already pulling her closer. "Probably," Helen agreed, her hands sliding up his chest. When their lips met, it was desperate and inevitable and dangerous, everything they'd been fighting since the restaurant. Arlie kissed her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning, his hands tangling in her hair, his body pressing her against the wall with barely controlled intensity. Helen kissed him back with equal hunger, tasting whiskey and darkness and the truth they'd both been running from. When they finally broke apart, gasping, Helen whispered, "This is real, isn't it?" Arlie's silence stretched between them, heavy with confession. Then his phone buzzed. "What?" "Twice. 3 times." He checked the screen and his entire body went rigid. "What?" Helen asked. "Another photo," he said, his voice hollow. "Taken 10 minutes ago." They were already inside the perimeter. And someone in his family had led them here. The contact's name was Miranda Chin, and she came with credentials that checked out: forged documents, untraceable routes, a history of making people disappear cleanly. She met Helen in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the safe house, speaking in low, efficient tones. "New identity, new city, new life," Miranda said, sliding a burner phone across the table. 48 hours and you're gone. No one finds you unless you want to be found." Helen stared at the phone like it was salvation and damnation in equal measure. "What's the catch?" "No catch. You leave tonight, don't look back, don't contact anyone from your old life." Miranda's expression was professionally sympathetic. "That includes him." Helen took the phone. Back at the safe house, she packed mechanically, the few belongings she'd accumulated, the designer clothes that had never felt like hers. Her hands moved on autopilot while her mind screamed in 1,000 different directions. She could leave. She could actually leave. She sat on the bed and pulled out paper, pen trembling in her hand. Arlie, by the time you read this I'll be gone. I'm sorry it has to be this way, but staying would destroy us both. You deserve someone who belongs in your world, not someone forced into it by your mother's manipulation. You deserve to be free of this lie. I hope you find whatever peace looks like for a man like you. Helen. She folded the letter, placed it on the pillow, picked up her bag, then heard voices from the corridor below. Helen froze. That was Mrs. Hebert's voice, cold and businesslike. And someone else, a man she didn't recognize. She shouldn't listen. She should leave now while she still could. Instead, she crept to the top of the stairs. Marconi's terms are acceptable, Mrs. Hebert was saying. Arlie's been too resistant to the necessary changes. Too attached to his father's old ways. And the girl? The girl was always disposable. She served her purpose, made Arlie vulnerable, distracted him from consolidating power. Mrs. Hebert's voice was matter-of-fact, clinical. When Marconi moves on him, Arlie will be too focused on protecting her to see the real threat. By the time he realizes what's happening, it will be too late. Helen's blood turned to ice. You're sacrificing your own son? The man sounded almost impressed. I'm securing the family's future. Arlie's too volatile, too unpredictable. Marconi will take over the organization, fold our operations into his, and I'll maintain my position as advisor. Everyone wins. Pause. Except Arlie, of course. And if the girl runs? Then Arlie has no reason to stay defensive. Either way he loses. Helen backed away from the stairs, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. The letter crumpled in her shaking hand. She wasn't just a pawn. She was leverage, a weapon Mrs. Hebert had placed deliberately to make Arlie vulnerable, to distract him while his own mother arranged his execution. The lie had never been about legitimizing the family. It was about controlling Arlie, breaking him. And Helen was the knife Mrs. Hebert had slipped between his ribs. If Helen left, Arlie would lower his guard, would stop being defensive, would walk straight into whatever trap Marconi had waiting. If she left, Arlie died. Helen looked at the letter in her hand, at freedom, at escape, at the life she desperately wanted back. Then she tore it into pieces. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket and typed a single message to Miranda. I'm staying. Some cages, Helen realized, you walked into by choice. And some people were worth fighting for, even if it meant becoming someone you never thought you'd be. She had to find Arlie. She had to warn him. Before his mother's betrayal became his epitaph. The family council convened at midnight in the mansion's formal dining room. The same room where Helen had first eaten with Arlie, where she'd begun to see the man beneath the armor. Now it was filled with the Hebert organization's most powerful members. Underbosses, captains, advisors. Men who'd killed without hesitation. Men who respected only strength. And Mrs. Hebert, seated at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her court. Arlie stood near the windows, tension radiating from him. He'd been summoning information about the traitor all day, following threads that led nowhere. He didn't know the betrayal was sitting right in front of him. The heavy doors opened. Every head turned. Helen walked in. She wore the midnight blue gown from the gala, her hair pulled back severely, her spine straight. She looked like she belonged here, not as decoration but as a force to be reckoned with. Miss Harris. Mrs. Hebert's voice was ice-wrapped in courtesy. This is a private meeting. I know. Helen's voice didn't waver. That's why I'm here. Arlie moved toward her. Helen, what are you? Your mother made a deal with Marconi, Helen said loud enough for everyone to hear. She's selling you out to secure her own position. The room went deadly silent. Mrs. Hebert's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. That's quite an accusation. It's the truth. Helen pulled out her phone, pressed play on a recording. Her voice, then Mrs. Hebert's, crystal clear, damning. You're sacrificing your own son? I'm securing the family's future. Arlie's too volatile, too unpredictable. The recording played through the entire conversation. With each word, the temperature in the room dropped. Men shifted in their seats. Hands moved toward concealed weapons. Arlie's face had gone pale, then flushed with something volcanic. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. Is this true? One of the underbosses, Victor, a man who'd served Arlie's father, stood slowly. You conspired with Marconi against your own blood. Mrs. Hebert rose to her full height, dignity intact. I did what was necessary. My son has become a liability. Too emotional. Too distracted. Her gaze cut to Helen. Too weak. Weak. Arlie's voice was deadly quiet. He crossed the room in measured steps. You used Helen to manipulate me. To make me vulnerable so Marconi could move in. I used her because she was useful, Mrs. Hebert said coldly. And you proved exactly why this organization needs stronger leadership. You let a nobody compromise your judgment. Helen stepped forward. I'm not your pawn, she said, her voice ringing clear. And he's not yours either. Mrs. Hebert's mask finally cracked. You stupid girl. You think exposing me saves him? You've just signed both your death warrants. Actually, Victor said, his weapon now drawn and pointed at Mrs. Hebert, she saved the organization from a traitor. Other guns appeared. Not all pointed at Mrs. Hebert. Alliances were fracturing in real time. Some men stood with the matriarch. Others moved to flank Arlie. The room balanced on a knife's edge. Choose, Mrs. Hebert said to Arlie, her voice icy. Your blood or your whore. Arlie looked at his mother, the woman who'd raised him, shaped him, prepared him for this empire. Then he looked at Helen, the woman who'd walked into fire rather than let him burn alone. He moved to Helen's side, his hand finding hers. I choose myself, he said quietly. For the first time in my life I choose what I want. He raised his voice. Anyone loyal to my mother leaves now. Anyone loyal to this family stands with me. The room shifted. More men moved to Arlie's side than Helen expected. Mrs. Hebert stood alone except for 3 loyalists who looked increasingly uncertain. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Hebert said, but for the first time she sounded almost human. Almost afraid. No, Arlie replied. I'm correcting yours. The empire would never be the same. But for the first time it would be his. The morning light cut through the mansion's windows differently now, sharper, clearer, like waking from a fever dream. Helen stood in what had been Mrs. Hebert's solarium, watching workers remove the orchids. The matriarch was gone, exiled to a villa in the south with enough money to live comfortably and enough distance to never interfere again. Some of the men had wanted harsher justice. Arlie had simply severed the ties that bound her to power. Miss Harris. Victor appeared in the doorway, no longer looking at her like she was an intruder. The accountants need your signature on the legitimization protocols. Your signature. Not Arlie's. Not a formality. Helen had spent 3 weeks dismantling Mrs. Hebert's web of shell companies, following paper trails that led to legitimate investments the organization desperately needed. She'd discovered she had a talent for seeing patterns others missed, for understanding the architecture of power. Her marketing background, the very ordinariness Mrs. Hebert had weaponized, made her invaluable. She knew how to sell narratives. How to rebrand monsters into businessmen. She was good at this. Terrifyingly good. The council meetings had shifted too. Helen didn't just attend, she spoke, advised, challenged. The men who'd once looked through her now listened when she outlined strategies for cleaning their money through real estate development, for pivoting operations away from the violence that had sustained them. She wasn't decorating Arlie's empire. She was helping rebuild it. She found him in his study after midnight, surrounded by ledgers and contracts. He looked up when she entered, exhaustion and something else, pride maybe, softening his features. The Ashford deal closed, he said. Your former CEO never suspected he was legitimizing us while expanding his portfolio. You were right about the approach. I usually am. Helen sat on the edge of his desk. You should get used to that. Arlie stood, moved close enough that she could feel his warmth. From his pocket, he produced a ring, sapphire and diamonds, elegant without being ostentatious. Nothing like the gaudy display Mrs. Hebert would have chosen. "Marry me," he said. No performance. No audience. Just the raw truth of him. Because you want to. Because you choose this. Helen took the ring, held it up to the light. It would look good on her hand. A symbol of everything she'd fought for, everything she'd become. "Ask me tomorrow," she said, smiling. Arlie's expression shifted. Surprise, then understanding, then something that looked like relief. Tomorrow? And the day after. And the day after that. Helen slid the ring onto her own finger, claiming it on her terms. "I'm choosing this, Arlie. But I'll keep choosing it every single day. That's the only way it works." He pulled her close and she went willingly, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because freedom, she'd learned, wasn't about escaping cages. It was about recognizing which doors you walked through by choice. She'd stopped being nobody the moment she'd refused to disappear. And she would never be invisible again. Thank you for reading. If you enjoyed this story, kindly like, subscribe, and share for more stories like this.